This video is part of our Macroeconomic Measures series. By the end of this video, you'll be able to define key terms related to macroeconomic policy. So far, we've talked about material that goes both ways, that you can use for micro or macro. Now we're diving in more specifically with the material that's solely macro-focused. Macroeconomics is going to focus on the whole economy. So you could talk about macroeconomics at maybe the state or province level, but we'll usually talk about macroeconomics in terms of just the entire country. So the economics of the United States would be a macro topic. Even large corporations would not count as macro. So they'd still be micro because we're still looking at individual choices, individual decisions. The indicators that we're going to use are statistics that measure aspects of the macroeconomy. So these would be things like GDP, which we'll be calculating today, measures of employment and unemployment, measures of inflation, and the misery index, which is the sum of inflation and unemployment. We'll talk about the misery index and its historical significance a little bit later on. The goals of macroeconomic policy involve economic growth, low unemployment, and low inflation. We've got some frameworks that we're going to go over. The first is the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. We'll also talk about the Keynesian model. Don't say Keynesian, say Keynesian. And the neoclassical model. And two main tools that we use will be monetary policy and fiscal policy. So keep all of these in mind as we work our way through the material over the next couple of classes. There are basically three main goals that we want to keep in mind when we're doing macroeconomic research. The first is that countries want to have predictable but high economic growth, which determines the standard of living in a country. We want to keep unemployment relatively low. We don't want to keep it at zero for reasons that we'll discuss a little bit later on. There will always be some unemployment, but we want to keep it relatively low. And we want to keep inflation relatively low as well. It's a sustained increase in the overall level of prices, so this can be problematic for us, and we'll talk a little bit more about this over the next couple of classes. We use different theories and models for the macroeconomy than we do for individual decisions in micro. We talked about theories of supply and demand earlier. In macro, we're going to use the theories of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. There are some important differences, but a lot of similarities there. We'll also discuss two key perspectives on macroeconomics, the neoclassical perspective and the Keynesian perspective, each of which puts its own spin on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Once we combine these two perspectives, you'll have a good understanding of what drives the macroeconomy and how we can think about making it move the way we want it to. The two main policy tools are monetary and fiscal policy. One moment here, this is fiscal, it is not physical policy, right? So, monetary policy involves managing interest rates and the availability of credit. That's usually done by a central bank. In the US, this is done by the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank. Fiscal policy is done by the government. That's Congress and the President. So there are a lot of very recent fiscal policy tools that we could talk about. Probably some of you guys are going to use them in your papers, so that would be a great place to start. Now that we've gotten to the end of this lecture, we want you to be able to define what is macroeconomics and what are the major economic indicators used to assess the state of the macroeconomy.